Easy English audiobook.
The Great Gatsby. Chapter 4. On Sunday morning, while church bells rang in the villages, the world returned to Gatsby's house. The guests laughed and sparkled on his lawn. "He's a bootlegger," said the young ladies moving between his cocktails and flowers. One time, he killed a man who found out he was nephew to von Hindenburg and second cousin to the devil. "Pass me a rose, honey, and pour me one last drop in that crystal glass." Once, I wrote down the names of those who came to Gatsby's house that summer on an empty timetable. It's old now, falling apart, but I can still read the names. They give a better picture than I can of the people who accepted Gatsby's hospitality and knew nothing about him. From East Egg came the Chester Beckers, the Leaches, and a man named Bunsen, who I knew at Yale, and Dr. Webster Civet, who drowned last summer up in Maine. There were the Hornbeams, the Willie Voltaires, and a whole clan named Blackbuck, who always gathered in a corner and looked down on everyone. There were the Ismays, the Christies, or rather Hubert Auerbach and Mr. Christie's wife, and Edgar Beaver, whose hair turned white one winter afternoon for no reason. Clarence Endive came from East Egg. He came once in white knickerbockers and had a fight with a bum named Etty in the garden. From farther out on the island came the Cheadles, the ORP Shredders, and the Stonewall Jackson Abrams of Georgia. Snell was there 3 days before he went to jail. He was so drunk on the driveway that Mrs. Ulysses Sweat's car ran over his hand. The Danceys came too, and S.B. Whitebait, who was over 60, Maurice A. Flink, the Hammerheads, and Beluga, the tobacco importer, and his girls. From West Egg came the Poles, the Mulreadys, Cecil Roebuck, Cecil Schoen, Gulick the state senator, Newton Orchid, who controlled films par excellence, Eckhoust, Clyde Cohen, Don S. Schwartz, the son, and Arthur McCarty, all connected with the movies. The Catlips, the Bembergs, G. Earl Muldoon, brother to the Muldoon who strangled his wife, Da Fontano the promoter, Ed Legros, James B. Rotgut. Ferret, the De Jongs, and Ernest Lilly came to gamble. When Ferret wandered into the garden, it meant he was broke, and Associated Traction would have to fluctuate profitably the next day. A man named Klipspringer was there so often he became known as the Boarder. I doubt he had any other home. There were theatrical people like Gus Wise, Horace O'Donovan, Lester Maya, George Duckweed, and Francis Bull. From New York came the Chromes, the Backhysons, the Dennickers, Russell Betty, the Corrigans, the Kellehers, the Dewars, the Scullys, S.W. Belcher, the Smirks, the young Quinns, now divorced, and Henry L. Palmetto, who killed himself by jumping in front of a subway train in Times Square. Benny McClenahan always arrived with 4 girls. They were never the same girls, but they looked so alike that it seemed they had been there before. I forgot their names: Jacqueline, Consuela, Gloria, Judy, or June. Their last names were either flowers and months or the names of rich American families. In addition to all these, I remember that Faustina O'Brien came once, the Baedeker girls, young Brewer, who had his nose shot off in the war, Mr. Albruxberger, Miss Hogg, his fiancée, Ardita Fitzpeters, Mr. P. Jewett, once head of the American Legion, Miss Claudia Hipp, a man said to be her chauffeur, and a prince of something we called Duke. All these people came to Gatsby's house in the summer. At 9 o'clock one morning in late July, Gatsby's fancy car pulled up my driveway, honking its 3-noted horn. It was the first time he had called on me, though I had been to 2 of his parties, used his hydroplane, and visited his beach often. "Good morning, old sport. You're having lunch with me today, and I thought we'd ride up together." He was balancing on the dashboard of his car, showing his American resourcefulness. This quality kept breaking through his polite manner. He was never quite still, there was always a tapping foot or a restless hand. He saw me looking at his car. "It's pretty, isn't it, old sport?" He jumped off to show me. "Haven't you seen it before?" I had seen it, everyone had. It was a rich cream color, bright with nickel, and filled with hat boxes, supper boxes, and toolboxes. We started to town, sitting behind many layers of glass in a green leather seat. I had talked with him maybe 6 times in the past month and found he had little to say. My first impression of him as someone important had faded. He was just the owner of a fancy house next door. Then came that surprising ride. We hadn't reached West Egg Village before Gatsby started leaving his sentences unfinished and slapping his knee in his caramel-colored suit. "Look here, old sport," he broke out suddenly. "What's your opinion of me?" A bit overwhelmed, I started with some vague answers. "Well, I'm going to tell you something about my life," he interrupted. "I don't want you to get the wrong idea about me from all these stories." So he knew about the strange rumors in his house. "I'll tell you the truth." His right hand made a serious gesture. "I am the son of wealthy people in the Middle West, all dead now. I was brought up in America but educated at Oxford because all my ancestors were educated there. It's a family tradition." He looked at me sideways, and I understood why Jordan Baker thought he was lying. He hurried over the words, "educated at Oxford," as if they bothered him. His whole story fell apart, and I wondered if there was something sinister about him. "What part of the Middle West?" I asked. "San Francisco. My family all died, and I came into a lot of money." His voice was serious, as if the memory of that sudden loss still haunted him. I wondered if he was joking, but a glance convinced me otherwise. "After that, I lived like a young prince in all the capitals of Europe, Paris, Venice, Rome, collecting jewels, hunting big game, painting a little, and trying to forget something very sad that happened long ago." With effort, I stopped myself from laughing. The phrases were so worn out that they brought no image to mind except a silly character chasing a tiger. Then came the war, old sport. It was a relief, and I tried hard to die, but I seemed to live a charmed life. I became a lieutenant when it started. In the Argonne Forest, I took my battalion so far forward that there was a half-mile gap on either side where the infantry couldn't advance. We stayed there for 2 days and nights, 130 men with 16 guns. When the infantry came up, they found the insignia of 3 German divisions among the dead. I was promoted to major, and every Allied government gave me a medal, even Montenegro. He lifted the word, Montenegro, with a nod and a smile. His smile understood Montenegro's history and sympathized with its struggles. My doubt faded into fascination. It was like skimming through a dozen magazines. He reached into his pocket and handed me a piece of metal on a ribbon. "That's from Montenegro." To my surprise, it looked real. "Ordere di Danilo," it said. "Montenegro Nicholas Rex. Turn it over. Major J. Gatsby," I read. "For extraordinary valor. Here's another thing I carry. A souvenir from Oxford days. It was taken in Trinity Quad. The man on my left is now the Earl of Doncaster." It was a photo of young men in blazers, lounging in an archway with many spires in the background. There was Gatsby, looking a little younger, with a cricket bat in his hand. Then it was all true. I saw the tiger skins in his palace, the chests of rubies to ease his broken heart. "I'm going to make a big request of you today," he said, pocketing his souvenirs with satisfaction. "I thought you should know something about me. I didn't want you to think I was just a nobody. You see, I usually find myself among strangers because I drift around, trying to forget sad things. You'll hear about it this afternoon." "At lunch?" "No, this afternoon. I found out you're taking Miss Baker to tea. Do you mean you're in love with Miss Baker? No, old sport, I'm not. But Miss Baker has kindly agreed to talk to you about this. I had no idea what this was, but I was more annoyed than interested. I hadn't asked Jordan to tea to discuss Gatsby. I was sure the request would be something strange, and for a moment, I regretted ever stepping onto his lawn. He wouldn't say another word. As we neared the city, he grew more correct. We passed Port Roosevelt with its red-belted ships and went through a slum lined with dark, empty saloons. Then the Valley of Ashes opened up, and I saw Mrs. Wilson straining at the garage pump as we went by. With fenders spread like wings, we scattered light through half of Astoria. As we twisted among the pillars of the elevated train, I heard the familiar jug-jug spat of a motorcycle and saw a policeman ride alongside. "All right, old sport," called Gatsby. We slowed down. He took a white card from his wallet and waved it before the policeman's eyes. "Right you are," agreed the policeman, tipping his cap. "I'll know you next time, Mr. Gatsby." "Excuse me, what was that?" I asked. "A picture of Oxford? I did the commissioner a favor once, and he sends me a Christmas card every year." We crossed the bridge, the city rising up in white heaps and sugar lumps built from money. The city seen from the Queensboro Bridge is always seen for the first time, with all the mystery and beauty in the world. A dead man passed us in a hearse heaped with flowers, followed by 2 carriages with drawn blinds and more cheerful carriages for friends. The friends looked out at us with tragic eyes and short upper lips, and I was glad Gatsby's car was part of their sad day. As we crossed Blackwell's Island, a limousine passed us, driven by a white chauffeur, with 3 stylish black people inside. I laughed as their eyes rolled toward us in haughty rivalry. Anything can happen now that we've crossed this bridge, I thought. Anything at all? Even Gatsby could happen without wonder. At noon, in a well-fanned cellar on 42nd Street, I met Gatsby for lunch. Blinking away the street's brightness, I saw him talking to another man. "Mr. Carraway, this is my friend, Mr. Wolfsheim." A small, flat-nosed Jew raised his large head and looked at me with 2 fine hairs in each nostril. After a moment, I found his tiny eyes in the half-darkness. "So I took one look at him," said Mr. Wolfsheim, shaking my hand earnestly. "And what do you think I did?" "What?" I asked politely, but he wasn't talking to me. He dropped my hand and covered Gatsby with his expressive nose. I handed the money to Catspaw and said, "All right, Catspaw, don't pay him a penny until he shuts his mouth." He shut it then and there. Gatsby took our arms and led us into the restaurant. Mr. Wolfsheim stopped speaking and became somber. "Highballs?" asked the waiter. "This is a nice place," said Mr. Wolfsheim, looking at the ceiling. "But I like across the street better." "Yes, highballs," agreed Gatsby. "But it's too hot over there." "Hot and small." "Yes," said Mr. Wolfsheim. "But full of memories." "What place is that?" I asked. "The old Metropole." "The old Metropole," said Mr. Wolfsheim gloomily. "Filled with faces dead and gone. Filled with friends gone forever. I can't forget the night they shot Rosie Rosenthal there. We were 6 at the table, and Rosie had eaten and drunk a lot all evening. When it was almost morning, the waiter came up with a strange look and said someone wanted to speak to him outside. "All right," said Rosie, getting up, but I pulled him back into his chair. "Let them come in here if they want you, Rosie. Don't move outside this room." It was 4 in the morning, and if we had raised the blinds, we'd have seen daylight. "Did he go?" I asked innocently. "Sure he went." Mr. Wolfsheim's nose flashed indignantly. He turned around in the door and said, "Don't let that waiter take my coffee." Then he went out, and they shot him 3 times in his full belly and drove away. 4 of them were electrocuted, I said, remembering. 5 with Becker. His nostrils turned to me with interest. I understand you're looking for a business connection. The sudden change was surprising. Gatsby answered for me. Oh no, he said. This isn't the man. No? Mr. Wolfsheim seemed disappointed. This is just a friend. I told you we'd talk about that some other time. I'm sorry, said Mr. Wolfsheim. I made a mistake. A delicious hash arrived, and Mr. Wolfsheim began to eat delicately but ferociously. His eyes roved around the room, inspecting everyone. I think he would have looked under our table if I hadn't been there. Look here, old sport, said Gatsby, leaning toward me. I'm afraid I made you angry this morning in the car. There was the smile again, but this time I resisted it. I don't like mysteries, I said. Why don't you just tell me what you want? Why does it have to come through Miss Baker? Oh, it's nothing sneaky, he assured me. Miss Baker's a great sportswoman, you know, and she'd never do anything wrong. Suddenly, he looked at his watch, jumped up, and hurried out, leaving me with Mr. Wolfsheim. He has to telephone, said Mr. Wolfsheim, following him with his eyes. He's a fine fellow, isn't he? Handsome and a perfect gentleman. Yes, he's an Oxford man. Oh, he went to Oxford College in England. You know it? I've heard of it. It's one of the most famous colleges in the world. Have you known Gatsby long? I asked. Several years, he said. I met him after the war and knew right away he was a man of fine breeding. I said, there's the kind of man you'd like to introduce to your family. He paused. I see you're looking at my cuff buttons. I hadn't been, but I did now. They were made of pieces of ivory. Human molars, he said. Well, I said, that's interesting. Yeah, he flipped his sleeves back. Yeah, Gatsby's very careful about women. He'd never look at a friend's wife. When Gatsby came back, Mr. Wolfsheim drank his coffee quickly and stood up. I've enjoyed my lunch, he said. I'm leaving before I overstay my welcome. Don't hurry, Meyer, said Gatsby without enthusiasm. Mr. Wolfsheim raised his hand in a sort of blessing. You're polite, but I belong to another generation, he said. You discuss your sports and young ladies. As for me, I'm 50 and won't impose myself any longer. As he shook hands and left, his sad nose trembled. I wondered if I had said something wrong. He's very sentimental sometimes, explained Gatsby. He's quite a character around New York, a denizen of Broadway. Who is he, an actor? No. A dentist? Meyer Wolfsheim? No, he's a gambler. Gatsby hesitated, then added, he's the man who fixed the World Series in 1919. Fixed the World Series? I repeated. The idea shocked me. I remembered the World Series had been fixed, but I thought of it as something that just happened. I never thought one man could play with the trust of 50 million people. How did he do that? I asked after a moment. He saw the chance. Why isn't he in jail? They can't catch him, old sport. He's smart. I insisted on paying the check. As the waiter brought my change, I saw Tom Buchanan across the room. Come with me for a minute, I said. I need to say hello to someone. When he saw us, Tom jumped up eagerly. Where've you been? He demanded. Daisy's furious because you haven't called. This is Mr. Gatsby, Mr. Buchanan. They shook hands briefly, and Gatsby looked embarrassed. How've you been? Tom asked me. How'd you come here to eat? I've been having lunch with Mr. Gatsby. I turned to Gatsby, but he was no longer there. One October day in 1917. Jordan Baker said that afternoon, sitting up straight in the tea garden at the Plaza Hotel. I was walking along, half on the sidewalks and half on the lawns. I liked the lawns because I had shoes from England with rubber knobs that bit into the soft ground. I had a new plaid skirt that blew a little in the wind, and whenever it did, the banners in front of the houses seemed to disapprove. The largest banner and lawn belonged to Daisy Fay's house. She was 18, 2 years older than me, and the most popular girl in Louisville. She dressed in white and had a white car. The telephone rang all day with young officers from Camp Taylor asking to see her that night. Even for an hour. When I walked by her house that morning, her white car was by the curb, and she was in it with a lieutenant I had never seen before. They were so focused on each other that she didn't see me until I was very close. "Hello, Jordan," she called. "Come here." I was flattered she wanted to talk to me because I admired her most of all the older girls. She asked if I was going to the Red Cross to make bandages. I was. She asked me to tell them she couldn't come that day. The officer looked at Daisy in a way every girl wants to be looked at, and because it seemed romantic, I remembered it. His name was Great Gatsby, and I didn't see him again for over 4 years. Even when I met him on Long Island, I didn't realize it was the same man. That was in 1917. By the next year, I had some boyfriends and played in tournaments, so I didn't see Daisy often. She went with a slightly older crowd. Wild rumors spread about her. How her mother found her packing to go to New York and say goodbye to a soldier going overseas. She was stopped, but she didn't talk to her family for weeks. After that, she only went out with a few young men who couldn't join the army. By the next autumn, she was happy again. She had a debut after the armistice, and in February, she was engaged to a man from New Orleans. In June, she married Tom Buchanan of Chicago with more ceremony than Louisville had ever seen. He came with 100 people in 4 private cars and rented a whole floor of the Mulbach Hotel. The day before the wedding, he gave her a string of pearls worth $350,000. I was a bridesmaid. I went to her room half an hour before the bridal dinner and found her on her bed, as lovely as the June night in her flowered dress, and as drunk as a monkey. She had a bottle of wine in one hand and a letter in the other. "Gratulate me," she mumbled. "Never had a drink before, but oh, how I enjoy it." "What's the matter, Daisy?" I was scared. I'd never seen a girl like that before. "Here, dearies." She groped in a wastebasket on the bed and pulled out the string of pearls. "Take them downstairs and give them back. Tell them Daisy's changed her mind. Say, Daisy's changed her mind." She began to cry. I rushed out, found her mother's maid, and we locked the door and put her in a cold bath. She wouldn't let go of the letter. She took it into the tub and squeezed it into a wet ball. She only let me leave it in the soap dish when it fell apart. But she didn't say another word. We gave her spirits of ammonia, put ice on her forehead, and hooked her back into her dress. Half an hour later, when we walked out, the pearls were around her neck, and the incident was over. The next day at 5 o'clock, she married Tom without a shiver and started off on a 3-month trip to the South Seas. I saw them in Santa Barbara when they came back, and I thought I'd never seen a girl so in love with her husband. If he left the room, she'd look around uneasily and say, "Where's Tom?" and have a worried expression until he returned. She used to sit on the sand with his head in her lap, rubbing her fingers over his eyes and looking at him with deep love. It was touching to see them together. It made you laugh quietly. That was in August. A week after I left Santa Barbara, Tom ran into a wagon on the road one night and ripped a wheel off his car. The girl with him made the papers because her arm was broken. She was a chambermaid at the Santa Barbara Hotel. The next April, Daisy had her little girl, and they went to France for a year. I saw them in Cannes and later in Deauville, then they came back to Chicago. Daisy was popular in Chicago. They moved with a fast crowd, all young, rich, and wild, but she kept a perfect reputation. Maybe because she didn't drink. It's good not to drink among heavy drinkers. You can keep your secrets and time your own mistakes so that no one sees or cares. Maybe Daisy never had any affairs at all. and yet there's something in her voice. About 6 weeks ago, she heard Gatsby's name for the first time in years. It was when I asked you, do you remember, if you knew Gatsby in West Egg? After you went home, she came into my room and woke me up, asking, what Gatsby? When I described him, she said it must be the man she used to know. It wasn't until then that I connected Gatsby with the officer in her white car. When Jordan Baker finished telling all this, we had left the plaza for half an hour and were driving through Central Park. The sun had set behind the tall buildings of the movie stars in the West 50s, and the clear voices of children already gathered like crickets on the grass rose through the hot twilight. I'm the Sheik of Araby. Your love belongs to me. At night when you're asleep, into your tent I'll creep. It was a strange coincidence, I said. But it wasn't a coincidence at all. Why not? Gatsby bought that house so Daisy would be just across the bay. Then it hadn't been just the stars he reached for that June night. He became real to me, delivered from his purposeless splendor. He wants to know, continued Jordan, if you'll invite Daisy to your house some afternoon and let him come over. The modesty of the request surprised me. He had waited 5 years and bought a mansion to host parties, all so he could come to my house. Did I need to know all this before he could ask such a small thing? He's afraid he's waited too long. He thought you might be offended. He's tough underneath it all. Something worried me. Why didn't he ask you to arrange a meeting? He wants her to see his house, she explained. And your house is next door. Oh, he half expected her to wander into one of his parties some night, Jordan continued, but she never did. Then he started asking people if they knew her, and I was the first he found. That night he sent for me at his dance, and you should have heard how carefully he asked. Of course, I suggested a lunch in New York, and he seemed almost crazy with worry. I don't want to do anything unusual, he kept saying. I want to see her right next door. When I said you were a friend of Tom's, he almost gave up the idea. He doesn't know much about Tom, though he says he's read a Chicago paper for years, hoping to see Daisy's name. It was dark now, and as we passed under a small bridge, I put my arm around Jordan's golden shoulder and asked her to dinner. Suddenly, I wasn't thinking about Daisy and Gatsby but about this clean, hard person who doubted everything and leaned back happily in my arm. A phrase began to repeat in my head. There are only the pursued, the pursuing, the busy, and the tired. And Daisy ought to have something in her life, murmured Jordan. Does she want to see Gatsby? She's not to know about it. Gatsby doesn't want her to know. You're just supposed to invite her to tea. We passed a barrier of dark trees, and then the light of 59th Street shone into the park. Unlike Gatsby and Tom, I had no girl whose face floated along the dark cornices and blinding signs, so I held the girl beside me, drawing her closer. Her scornful mouth smiled, and I drew her closer again, this time to my face.